For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu. This episode was made possible in part by the generous support of the Tyndale House Foundation. For more information, visit tyndale.foundation.
So what's the hope? Well, the hope is a kind of still, small voice. The voice of, you might say, human ethical invention. And I'm thinking of things like the rise of nonviolent resistance. The usual rule is that violence produces more violence and more violence is suspended because they go at it in a way which recognizes the humanity of the other, even the adversary, and is constantly proposing to the adversary that we turn this conflict into a collaboration in which we both can realize our human nature. This sometimes works and sometimes is taken up by the other side, and you get a real step forward.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity.
I'm Ryan McAnnally-Linz with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. We're living at the end of a strange moral century. 100 years ago, the world was marked by a global pandemic, the end of a long war, fights over gender inequality and racial injustice, and the precipice of a broken economy. And people in 1921 simply had no idea what kind of violence, bloodshed, and upheaval was still to come. And yet, even over the course of a century filled with all too human evil, we can trace a faint golden thread of moral invention. Commitments to human dignity, universal human rights, suffrage and democracy, solidarity with the marginalized and suffering, equality. The spread of these ideas also marks the last 100 years. The disparity is stark. At another moment of conflict and uncertainty, like the one we find ourselves in now, the fate of that golden thread is unclear. This is part 2 of our conversation with philosopher Charles Taylor. Author of Sources of the Self, The Ethics of Authenticity, A Secular Age, and much more, Taylor exemplifies determined, imaginative, generous intellectual commitment to a fundamental question: what is humanity for? This is one of the foundational questions of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and this podcast, seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. Following Taylor, we want to help people to better understand themselves, their world, and the significance of their lives. Today, Charles Taylor, Miroslav Volf, and I discuss the promise of hope in its political and theological context. We continue to talk about the response we need for the epistemological crisis of so-called post-truth politics, restoring trust in each other, the relation between individual freedom and public common good, the need to recover solidarity and sacred encounter between humans during this time, and finally, the promise of democracy for living up to our moral ideals. Thanks for joining us. We left our conversation last time with the suggestion of hope.
I think be not afraid is the call, but the fear is so gripping at the moment. This is not the end of Christianity. The arrival of the secular age is a new phase in the realization, penetration of the Christian faith into the world in which we live. There are all sorts of ways in which Christ and the love of God is present in our society. This space is being filled with the Christian message in different forms. This is not the end of a story. I mean, one needs a kind of hope. That's really what in a certain sense, the evangelical virtue that we need now is one of hope.
This hope is by definition incomplete and unrealized. It fixes our eyes on a future good we cannot see, as an alternative to the many varieties of fear in our world. Fear of the stranger, fear of uncertainty, fear of mystery, fear of the truth, fear of replacement, fear of missing out, fear of not having enough. Before we pick up on the moral extent of this hope, we need to back up a bit. One of Taylor's current projects is about the huge disparity between the human propensity for evil on the one hand and the moral progress we've made on the other. Taylor identifies a still, small voice of human ethical invention that recognizes our common human dignity. This idea has spread, but its growth has been slow through human history, and there's no guarantee of its final achievement. Advances are nonlinear, Taylor points out, and often moral progress triggers new waves of degradation. I asked him to explain what he's after here, and it's important context for the rest of our conversation.
I've been thinking for a long time of how we've got as far as we've got, how far is where we've got, and how to take it forward. How do we get this far? We got to a point where people in the 18th century wouldn't have recognized our generally accepted standards across the world, as reflected in things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 of the UN, and as recognized in the fact that those standards are very rarely challenged as such, even by the greatest criminals and deniers of what they actually require. I mean, the only case that I think we really know, big scale case in the 20th century, was Hitler, who definitely just despised those standards and stood for no kind of universalism, just the right of our folk to crush others. But that was the immediate background to the Universal Declaration. The bounce back from that was a kind of universal acceptance of the standards of universal human rights. So what we have today is an immense amount of hypocrisy and lying. Why couldn't Xi Jinping just say, well, we're doing these poor, benighted Muslims a favor by making them into intelligent Chinese, which is obviously what he thinks. Why does he have to say, no, it's a lie, the Americans are trying to calumny China and so on? Why? So you have, on one hand, these very high standards. On the other hand, you have them very often leading to counterproductive, exactly the opposite results. That is, the attempts to realize something like these standards, and communism is another such attempt, because of the methods used, absolutely brutal and unmitigated measures used, ends up producing, in the case of Stalin, in the case of Pol Pot, in the case of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao and now under Xi, ends up producing absolutely horrible results. I mean, massacres on a vast scale and repression on a vast scale. And there are two ways in which these high standards turn out to be functionally or in fact producing the opposite. One is this, that there are attempts to realize them in a very strange way involving force. And secondly, they stand as a kind of provocation to people who would really like to negate them. And that's definitely the case with Hitler. You can see when you see the conversations of Hitler and Goebbels that they're actually, particularly Goebbels, they're actually excited by the idea of trashing all the bien pensant notions of human equality and so on, and laughing, of course, at Christianity with this weak attempt to bring in everybody and so on. So you get a very common consequence for human beings that very often the very idea of going against what is generally accepted as the right awakens a kind of excitement. And I think you see this in all the cases where violence is used. Violence begins to become a kind of drug that you're feeding yourself. And so that people go, as the present Taliban, for instance, in Afghanistan, beyond all limits of what would be functional for them as holders of power, and just lash out. So you get, on one hand, these tremendously high standards. You get, on the other hand, tremendous falling below. I mean, the falling below them even on scale in the 20th century, unprecedented in history, right? The massive massacres that, Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, and so on. And then, so what's the hope here? Well, the hope is a kind of still, small voice. The voice of, you might say, human ethical invention. I think it's the theological background of this, but I think it makes itself evident to everybody in human moral invention. And I'm thinking of things like the rise of nonviolent resistance, where people have to resist. They have to find a way to free themselves from colonial rule, for instance, or in other cases from these kind of dictatorships which have gone haywire. But they've discovered a way of doing it where the usual rule is that violence produces more violence and more violence is suspended, because they go at it in a way which recognizes the humanity of the other, even the adversary, and is constantly proposing to the adversary that we turn this conflict into a collaboration in which we both can realize our human, I would say our human nature, because I think I'm very frankly an Aristotelian in this sense. It's a human form that is trying to realize itself. And this sometimes works and sometimes is taken up by the other side, and you get a real step forward. You see this, of course, you can trace this through the nonviolent movement from Gandhi to Martin Luther King. Interesting enough, all the revolutions in Eastern Europe and Russia, particularly Eastern Europe, against the communist regimes, were all astonishingly nonviolent. Right? There was not a drop of blood spilt in them.
Miroslav, as someone who grew up in one of those communist regimes that Charles is describing as in some ways kind of a misfiring of democratic ideals, I wonder if you might reflect on that experience, on your commitment to nonviolence, and on how it shaped your stance towards and stake in democratic societies today and going forward.
Yeah, I grew up in a mildly communist society, which might seem like contradiction in terms, but Tito's Yugoslavia was relatively free of kind of strong forms of repression. But nonetheless, there was a pressure, especially on religious people, to keep their voices down. We couldn't be who we truly thought we were and wanted to be, aspired to be. And obviously the Yugoslavia had to manage not just a single religion, but multiple religions or versions of a religion, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Islam, and try to figure out how to have these competing voices live together in the same common space. And what they did, they kind of repressed everyone and imposed a certain kind of ideology. Now, for me, that became one of the major occasions why I kind of embraced something like political liberalism as a mode of being able to express oneself and your own vision of life. In fact, I think my first conscious political act was to protest Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, Prague Spring. That was in August, late August. I was 12 years old, and I was screaming at the top of my voice, Tito Dubček Svoboda. This is our freedom. Naša je sloboda. And I think in many ways that kind of that moment defined my own stance toward these issues. How does one on the one hand, be who one is, but on the other hand, live in peaceful coexistence with other folks? And of course, the kind of nonviolent strand of Christianity in which I grew up was very, very important in shaping my perspective.
From this point, in light of Charles's comments on the need for hope in response to fear, Miroslav picked up on the sense of obligation to hope.
Fear not. Generally, doesn't work as a command in some ways unless it's accompanied by something else. It's right. Don't be afraid, or don't be depressed, and it doesn't work. But fear not. The reverse side of fear not is, as you mentioned so well, is there are reasons to hope. There's a promise on which one can latch on, and it's that promise, I think, and hope that can overcome the fear. I mean, you yourself are so incredibly hopeful. Every time I talk to you or read you, there's a kind of hope that permeates what you are doing, what you are saying, and the spirit in which you are saying, and especially in today's environment, which is a kind of no future cultural climate in many domains. How do you cultivate? So maybe a different way to ask Ryan's question might be, how do you cultivate this kind of optimism? Would be too cheap, but this kind of hopefulness, this sense of positivity in the context of what many people see is a dystopian time?
Well, I think it's partly, I feel we have an obligation. I mean, that I'll refer to Kant here. I don't often do that, but he also thought that we have an obligation to believe that it can go forward. Or I let appeal to one of the famous Marxist writers of the 20th century, Gramsci. What is it? Pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. I mean, I think that. So I feel that. Yeah, I have moments where, frankly, I'm not surprised to hear that I have moments when I lose kind of the thread and I don't have the feeling strongly anymore, and terrible things are happening outside there. But I know that you can, if you just hang in there, you can recover that again. And I see that we have a very profound obligation, call, to take this stance. I mean, that somehow probably weakens the effect of my optimism when people say, well, he's trying so hard. Well, okay, but maybe I shouldn't have told you all this. but I think we have to be quite frank with ourselves and each other. I think that this kind of hanging in there is rewarded by a renewed sense.
This is really important. I find very important what you said. And generally, people don't think in terms of an obligation to hope in the sense in which you are describing right now, as if somehow it has to simply be there. And rather than something that actually we have moral responsibility to do. And it seems to me, especially in today's environment, thinking of it as moral responsibility is an immensely helpful thing. So thank you.
Oh, good.
I'd like to jump in if I could. And come back to something you said fairly early in our conversation, Charles. I think you alluded to the now kind of proverbial post-truth moment that we're in.
Yeah.
And the ways that a quest for certainty and moral purity can end up rationalizing violence. The heightened violence of reform gone wild, right?
Yeah.
We had several listeners with questions about the epistemic crises we face in a post-truth world, calling the meaning of facts and even reality into question. Bonnie Christian asks, how can we achieve ethical growth or gain moral knowledge in a time of epistemic crisis? Maybe our Yale colleague, Jennifer Hurt, sums up the spirit of these questions well.
You've written in such illuminating ways about the quest for certainty and moral purity, and about how these often end up rationalizing violence in service of the eradication of error and of evil. And I'm wondering how you might relate that analysis to our contemporary post-truth historical moment, in which various groups that perceive themselves as under attack seek epistemic closure that seals themselves off from an enemy that they regarded as absolutely unworthy of engagement, even at the cost of massive loss of life, as we're seeing in politically motivated anti-masking and anti-vaccination campaigns. What sources of hope would you name for restoring basic forms of social trust and commitment to pursuit of a common life?
How to restore this hope? Well, I think that there are negative things you can do to reduce the efficacy of the post-truth situation, of the enclosure, right? I think that we haven't explored them enough, but this doesn't get to the heart of this is a preliminary, it doesn't get to the heart of your challenge. But we have a very, very counterproductive set of rules about what you can publish, platforms that are allowed, more and more being asked to take things off, but also whole media like Fox News, who should have been fined billions of dollars in any kind of civilized society. If I take you as an individual and try to calumny against you, you make a case against me and you take me a lot of money and force me to, take it back. But if I produce a set of supposed facts which make society unlivable and unmanageable, you get away scot-free. So there's some measures we can take about that. Yeah, but in the end, you're faced with people who are utterly opposed because they have this tremendous, all mobilizing fear. And so really what you're asking is how you can break through the channels of that fear. And I think, you have to take it out of a shoving match. But if you can sit down with somebody of that orientation and say, look, we're both Christians, isn't there something strange here? We're so violently against each other. Let's look at this. Let's think of this. If you could get across to someone like me, can get across to someone in that bubble that I also have a living Christian faith, it would undermine the basic premise of their whole political action. It would deeply undermine it. And it's reciprocal. If I really sat down with them and listened to them, I would become aware that they are much more complex in their identity than simply this one thing which is coming to dominate them politically, right? That they have relationships, problems, fears, hopes, and so on, which I could understand and which I could even perhaps help, give them some kind of help in realizing. So there is, but this is the utopianness of this, is how do you get these conversations going? Now, sometimes it's been done. There are small groups that are brought together by some really far-sighted organization, people from each side, and there has to be a certain willingness to exchange, and they spend a weekend together and they talk. And what invariably happens is a sense of mutual diabolization declines, right? And they come to see that there are humans on the other side. So maybe we need a multiplication of this kind of meeting. These walls, barriers can be melted. It's sufficient that they see a Christian on the other side, that the basic premise of their whole action is weakened. Because the whole thing, the only Christian life is the one that's in the fortress defending itself against these awful people from the outside.
I find sometimes that when you have people one-on-one, people are open and they make journey with one another. But as soon as they imagine themselves back within the group, kind of the inner need of the conflictual situation between two groups hijacks the gain that has been made on an interpersonal level, and how to penetrate so that they how does one make this change to stay and, so to say, fertilize the environment in which they find themselves? That seems to me a very important challenge.
Yeah. So how to multiply this kind of conversation, make it possible outside the context of I'm cursing at you, you're cursing at me.
And I mean, speaking autobiographically here, personally, I think the pandemic has made this especially hard.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense that for pretty much anybody on that either the other side is trying very desperately to curtail your freedoms and your way of life, or that the other side is cavalierly putting your actual life at risk. And this isn't really to ask a question so much as to say, boy, that seems like a tough mountain to climb, particularly when we have this year and a half of barely being together at all, much less together in ways that might form these kinds of bonds.
Yeah. I mean, part of the difficulty is that the ways in which it plays out, for instance, around masks, is in some ways so absurd. What's the relationship between not wearing a mask and being a believing Christian? You have to have several intermediate links of gangs that have got in order to see this. So, and that's why people on my side are tempted to say, "Oh, they're so dumb, just don't get it." And so, so it makes it very, very hard.
I'm wondering, Charles, whether the question of masks and some of the other questions also of the similar stripe, because they on the surface they look silly. As you say, what's the connection between either Christian faith or masks, non-masks, or some kind of political ideology or some deep interest? It doesn't seem to be there. They almost stand for kind of freedom to do what I want to do with my life, and that takes me back to the question for democracy.
Okay, that's interesting. On a related note, David Moe asks, what kind of democracy does the religiously pluralistic world today need?
Yeah.
How does religion shape the moral principle of that democracy?
There's a sense among people that their lives are being ruled and determined by forces that are outside of their domain and outside of the sphere of their understanding. So the elites run the world, and the medical profession can end up standing for elites here, which is unfortunate, but that's how it ends up functioning. So there is a kind of rebellion from below against imposition from outside. And I'm wondering what democracies might be able to do in order to allay this, because democracy depends on everybody having their own voice and their own voice heard. But if you have such a large percentage of population who think that their voices are being taken away from them, it's a problem for democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is another very powerful, what do we call it, value or goal, which could come into operation here, and that's solidarity. I mean, that's really what the other side is appealing to. Look, you're putting in danger. See, you're satisfying your own desire not to be controlled, but you're putting in danger someone else that you're going to pass the disease on to, and maybe they'll pass it to their grandmother, and it'll be the end of her. And so we have to, this is one of the big things we have to recover, a sense of the importance of solidarity. And I think that perhaps it's something maybe peculiar to the United States in the way in which this has been sidelined as a crucial value. I mean, the French Revolutionary trilogy, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, let's translate fraternity by solidarity, that we owe something to each other. Right? And the Republicans, of course, have been preaching for a long time in the States is uniquely, I think, perverse with various right-wing parties. Denial of solidarity. Everybody ought to be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and if they don't, they deserve everything they get, and so on. But there must be a way of recreating that sense of the really important value of solidarity. And that's the counter thrust.
I wonder, we've spent a lot of time talking about the perils of democracy today, but we've gotten glancing glimpses, I think, of what it is that democracy, what human potential or human good democracy expresses or realizes, or at least might be hoped to express or realize. And I was wondering if we might close by you just expressing it. What is it in that Aristotelian teleological account of human being that you think democracy accords with, that means that it's worth doing the hard work to rebuild solidarity and social trust?
Well, I think, that Aristotle had this right. I mean, although he had a very sort of elite version of it, the polis is a really exceptional way of life because, of course, forgetting all the exceptions, women, slaves, and so on, it allows agents together to determine their common life and to deliberate and discover what is right by what he called reason. And I think that is part of the telos of human life, that we become capable of running our own lives. Now, this is something much more complicated in modern democracy, which wants to include everybody, than it was in Aristotle's day. But I think we're living today a much richer and broader version of the same sense of telos. So there's that. And there's another thing, too, that it's not just that we have to collaborate in order to order our own lives by our own reasoning. That's part of it. It's also that we have so much to offer each other in the way of gifts, in the way of insights, and a life which is enriched by this kind of exchange is much greater and more human than a life that doesn't have that. And I'd jump to our Pope Francis. I was very, very impressed in the Fratelli Tutti. There's a whole section which suddenly intervenes, I've forgotten what the number is, where he says that human beings were meant to meet very different people, to exchange with them. It's a kind of enrichment of our understanding of human life and human possibility that comes from that. You can even see him, as it were, developing his own Aristotelian theory, in which part of the telos of human life is this kind of mutual enrichment and exchange and understanding of the complexity and richness of the human condition. So it's not just that we're learning how to order our lives together, because you can't order life, not together without domination of one by the other. It's not just that, it's also that we can collaborate across these great differences. In a sense, in my own experience in life, the enrichment of, I've met a lot of people, because it's a wonderful thing in the 20th and 21st centuries. You travel and you meet people and you form friendships and very, very different cultures. And I felt and religions, and I felt myself to be immensely privileged, immensely enriched by this. So this resonates with me, but I think it's also a very great insight. I mean, just one last word here. These recent encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, it's not like the old days. They're not just telling the faithful what they should believe. They are taking part in a cross-confessional, ecumenical discussion about what the telos of human life is all about. In the case of Laudato Si, it's feeding ourselves part of this natural whole. And in this case, and this is addressed to everybody. None of this is addressed to Catholics. It's addressed to our attempt to. That's what I call. This is the part of what I'm talking about. The strange ethical growth which we're being pushed today.
Charles, Miroslav, Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really enriching conversation.
I've enjoyed it very much, Ryan.
Yeah, it's been, to me, very, very interesting.
Just like 100 years ago, we're tracing a golden thread of hope through a pandemic, a volatile and uncertain end to a long war, widespread resentment and distrust of each other. The fight continues for equality and functional democracy that redounds to the dignity and benefit of all. I hope you found in this conversation with Charles Taylor an invitation. It's an invitation to continue the slow but confident exploration of our humanity and its implications. It's an invitation to strive to narrow the chasm between the genius of moral invention and the human propensity for wrongdoing. And it's an invitation to a life really worth living. We'll continue our work towards those ends and hope you'll join us. Whether that means subscribing to the podcast, sharing this episode with a friend, or becoming a donor to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, we're grateful you're with us and honored to envision and pursue lives worthy of our common humanity with you. Thanks for listening.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured philosopher Charles Taylor and theologians Miroslav Volf and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. Production assistance by Martin Chan and Nathan Jowers. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, with the occasional midweek. If you're new to the show, we're so glad that you found us. Remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. And if you've been listening for a while, thank you, friends. If you're liking what you're hearing, I've got a request. Would you support us? It's pretty simple, really, and won't take much time. Here are some ideas. First, you could hit the share button for this episode in your app and send a text or email to a friend or share it to your social feed. Second, you could give us an honest rating on Apple Podcasts. How are we really doing? Finally, you could write a short review of the show in Apple Podcasts. Reviews are cool because they'll help like-minded people get an idea for what we're all about and what's most meaningful to you, our listeners. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.